Hi, and welcome back to Enchantment in Greencastle. I hope you've been enjoying these videos that I have been making, which are to promote my work. A lot of them are to promote my books, some are to promote the resellers rack that I have here, and some are to promote my shell collection. Enchantment's slogan is Books, Boutique, Beachcombing, and so I'm doing these videos to promote each one of them. Today I'm going to be reading another short story. This is the story of the month, written and published in 2011. I'm going to just jump ahead, and the story I am reading is His Last Meal. As I read this story, there is a message that is behind it. The story also involves a celebrity, and it involves a play, and I'm sure that everyone would be able to recognize who the celebrity is. And let's see how well into the story you would identify who I'm talking about. Here's His Last Meal, set in Atlanta, Georgia. As John gazed half-blinded into the depths of the garbage bin, he scrutinized the contents carefully. Despite the growling of his empty stomach, his selection had to be more than his ordinary eat-to-survive meal. He wanted to choose wisely, find something he could savor, something that would warm his stomach and bring memories of a happier time, something worthy of a last meal. He pulled back an empty carton of milk, 2 empty boxes of Frosted Flakes, and a few brown paper bags. He stopped for a moment to stare at the cereal boxes. He remembered having Frosted Flakes in his mother's kitchen with warm milk from a pot on the stove. His mother had always warned him and his brothers to let the milk cool a bit before they poured it over the cereal. But the warnings were to no avail for John. He liked his cereal soggy, and he appreciated the warm milk cooling his insides in what seemed like always winter in their apartment. He didn't mind the soggy cereal at all. What he did mind was that there was always so little of it to go around. And by the time the box came around to him, 4 pairs of hands had already poured from it. The cold November wind slapped him in the face, and his head shot back, nostrils flared, eyes bulging and beginning to water. His feet on the chapped pavement of the old theater was as charred as the ground he stood on, and freezing. John feared that when he tried to move, the soles of his feet would detach and leave the toes behind, frozen to the pavement, as a testament to the homeless, barefooted man who stood there in search of food. People would pass over it and shake their heads in shame, asking themselves what could bring a human being to this point, until the sanitation department came and scraped his toes up off the pavement, they too shaking their heads in shame. John never wanted to be pitied. He dug deeper, careful not to spill the contents over the side of the bin. He might be homeless, but he was no slob. A few years ago, the mayor for the city of Atlanta had increased fines for those caught littering. And in efforts to clean up the city, more garbage bins had been installed in and around all public establishments in the city. For John and many others like him, more garbage bins meant more chances for people to discard food, shoes, and clothing. It had been a long time since he had found a pair of shoes that could fit him. At 6'3", his size 13 were difficult to shop for even in the best of times. And it was a stretch for him to remember when the best of times had been. The last time he could recall being happy was when he and Candace had moved into their own apartment. That was 10 years ago. Candace, He tried to say her name, but it faded on his quivering full lips as the memory of her had faded. She, that apartment, the man who had stood so proudly in those flow-shine shoes and swept her off her feet, had died a long time ago. So this is now going back to John and Candace. John, come on now, put me down. I'm going to be late for my shift. What shift, baby? Can't you just call in sick for once? John asked playfully as he placed his petite wife back on her own 2 feet. We just moved into our first apartment, for God's sakes, and you haven't even really looked at it all yet. I'll have plenty of time to do that later, and tomorrow, and the next day. This is home for a long time, sweetie. But we know we both need to bring in a paycheck into this little crib. Candace kissed him quickly on the lips and tried to escape the muscular brown arms, but John pulled her back, feeling the warmth of her body soak into the crevice of his, almost as if the spot had been carved for her to fit into like a piece in a puzzle. He kissed her again, this time hungrily, tasting the coffee on her tongue, her teeth, her lips. He reminded himself to get some ground Starbucks so that he could make it for her any time she wanted it. Have a good day, baby. I'll have a celebration dinner waiting for you when you get back, John said, his cheeks plump and almost bursting with joy. He truly felt as if he was floating. Oh, really? What will we have? Candace asked, her eyes sparkling, and the dimples in her cheeks out in full glory. She still clung to his neck, her short, chopped hair, shiny and sleek, falling back over her round face. She looked up at him like a child looking up from Santa's lap, and John knew for the first time that there was a strong possibility he could give her whatever she wanted. Never you mind. You'll find out tonight when you get back, he said. She kissed him one last time, grabbed her handbag from a chair, and headed for the door. You'd better have all those boxes in off the curb and stored away when I get back, she shouted. Yes, ma'am, he answered. With the sound of her Volkswagen Beetle starting up and pulling out of the driveway, John opened his front door. He stood for a moment on the threshold, then took a step out into the bright morning sunshine. He looked up, felt the sun pouring down on him, and the warmth of the glow was so blinding he had to close his eyes. With his eyes closed, he felt a hope that life had changed. The childhood of poverty, the whooping from a man he only saw when it was whooping time, the constantly bare cupboards, the names he was called at school that he gradually believed to be true, and the countless time he heard the prediction that no one would buy his art, all of it paled in comparison to the hope he felt right now. By the time Candace returned, he had brought in all the boxes and emptied the ones she had given him the okay to. The rest had been neatly stored in a back laundry room, and his artwork had been set out in the spare bedroom. Dinner was on the table, candles lit around it, a bottle of white wine sat on ice, and soft music played on the stereo. Candace took a few minutes to freshen up and change out of her waitress uniform, then joined him at the table. John had prepared rack of lamb with rosemary and plum cherries. For sides, he had made creamy mashed potatoes and fresh green beans. He swore to Candace that he had actually shopped and prepared everything himself and not gone out to a restaurant to get the food. They both enjoyed their meal, and afterwards they took a long hot bubble bath together. Then John gave Candace a massage as she dozed off. When they went to bed that night, the first in their new apartment, Candace felt she had been so blessed with her husband. She knew that she and this apartment meant She knew what she and this apartment meant to John. She knew that finally getting his own exhibition the following week was the big break he had been waiting for many years. And she knew that despite the overwhelming amount of black men who were on the streets, on drugs, committing crimes, or behind bars, she had a good black man, and she would always show her appreciation for him. Candace died that summer. She had been working the late night shift, and when John arrived to pick her up at midnight, refusing to let her drive herself at that hour, he was met by the restaurant owner. A robbery had occurred, and 2 of the waitresses, including Candace, had been shot to prove a point. The 2 masked gunmen had escaped before the police could arrive on the scene. John was told that he could follow the ambulance, which had just left 5 minutes ago, but that Candace had died instantly. She didn't suffer much. Now back to present day. John searched around the clutter a few more minutes, deciding that he couldn't stand there much longer and should move on to the next bin when he struck gold. A Snickers bar with only a small portion taken off the top came to his hand, and it was as good. Now this was as good as it got. At least it would have to be for him. He loved Snickers bars. They were the small luxuries he had only gotten at Christmas time as a child. As an adult, he had bought himself one as a guilty pleasure each time he had sold a painting. But sweets were the last things people threw away, and here was an almost complete bar. He wondered if that meant something was wrong with it. Eating rotting food was a risk he couldn't take, because that meant getting sick to his stomach, and he wouldn't even be allowed to enter the hospital doors. Not that he had a problem with dying. On the contrary, his fear was the most likely chance he would suffer the humiliation of needing the toilet urgently, or vomiting up the little food in his system and then live on. And he needed this time to be about calm and peace. He wanted the waters to cover his head and to look up into the starry night sky and drift off into blissful slumber. Maybe the bar had been thrown away by a spoiled child who had fussed over something he couldn't have and threw the Snickers away as a defiant move to anger his parent. John hoped this had been the case. A sniff of the bar only revealed rich caramel and chocolate aromas, which gave him hope that his suspicions were of the latter. John spent most of his days around theaters and restaurants, and was often lucky enough to actually observe food being dumped. Then he would go and get what was edible from it. He loved when he caught the pizza guy by the bins. The chubby man would actually stand a few minutes and wait for him to walk up, and would put the cartons into his hands. He never looked into John's eyes, but John preferred it that way. Attached to the Snickers wrapper was what appeared to be a theater ticket. John pulled it off quickly and attempted to flick it back onto the pile, but the piece of paper was stuck to his fingers with the caramel from the candy bar. He flicked his fingers again, anxious to get to the meal, as people coming and going around the theater gave him disgusted passing glances. Man, is he going to eat that? A little boy, no more than 8, asked his friends as they stood on the curb. The look on their faces was that of pure shame. John retreated to a nearby alley and crouched in the semi-darkness, taking solace in some semblance of warmth. Soon all of this would be over. There wouldn't be anyone staring at him, judging, accusing. He wouldn't be a man among many on the streets of Atlanta. He wouldn't have to fear looking up and seeing his reflection by mistake in a glass window. Looking at the ghost of the man Candace would never have the agony of seeing. John hungrily devoured the Snickers bar. It was delicious. He closed his eyes as he felt the morsels crush then melt between his teeth, the sweetness soaking his parched tongue with warm gooiness. A burst of energy shot up to his brain, and he felt it trickle down to his fingers and finally to his half-frozen toes. There was nothing whatsoever wrong with the candy. Maybe his assumptions that a spoiled child had discarded it without thought had been correct. John shook his head even as he thanked the ungrateful child with all his heart. He thanked the ungrateful child that for this moment his stomach felt something other than empty. He now felt he had the strength to walk down to Mitchell Street Bridge. That was as far as he needed to get. As he began to push his dirty, chapped hands in his pockets, he was amazed to note that the ticket was still dangling from the side of his hand. He had completely forgotten about it in his haste and joy to finish his meal. Now he regarded the ticket with a raised eyebrow. It was a valid ticket for a live performance play. He wondered why someone would throw away a perfectly good ticket. Maybe it was the same person who had thrown away the perfectly good Snickers. Or maybe the ticket had been accidentally lost or caught up in the wintry night. "Who's this guy?" John asked aloud to no one in particular regarding the playwright. There was only the sound of the howling winds whipping through the alley walls. As he stepped back out into the night, he stopped for a moment as if waiting for something and not knowing exactly what it was he was waiting for. He had had his last meal. There was no note to write. Where would he leave it? For the past year and a half, he had slept beneath bridges, in abandoned vehicles, and on park benches when weather allowed. But more importantly, who would he write a note to? 2 of his brothers had been killed in street gangs, and the other 2 were behind bars. One for murder, the other for assault on a police officer. At least that had been the last he had heard of them. John made sure to stay far away from his old neighborhood. His mother had stayed with his father, enduring the abuse. John hadn't seen them since the day of Candace's funeral, when his parents had joined Candace's, then went their separate ways, never to hear from each other again. John knew they all blamed him for Candace's death, but he had taken a job in one of the more traditional positions, instead of following some crazy dream to touch the world with his art, he would have been bringing more to the table. And Candace could have gone to nursing school like she had planned to before she met John. He had come into her life and had put that gun to her head as surely as the robber had. So, no, there wasn't anyone to leave a note saying that he was sorry. All that was left for him now was to walk to the bridge. That was all. The bridge was as far as he needed to get. John took a step forward, but then gazed over at the theater. On the marquee was a picture of a large woman dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, wearing what was obviously a big curly white wig. She was standing behind bars with a cigarette between her fingers and a huge smile on her lips. The production was sold out and the only feature playing that entire week. The look on the woman's face was comical, but it also held something else, something John couldn't quite put his finger on, but it reached deep within his soul and pulled him to it. What do I have to lose by going in to see this play? He thought. Then he looked down at his feet. If, by some stroke of luck, he was able to pull off entering the theater in the ragged brown pants and shirt he wore, covered with a tattered black leather jacket, there was definitely no way he could get past security barefooted. He willed himself to think quickly as he noted people rushing into the hall. A group of men that John mentally labeled as basketball players came huddled up to the entrance of the theater. Even John was quite impressed with the picture they painted, and it was enough to convince him that if these men were going to see the production, it was of macho caliber. The shortest of the group of six was about 5'11" and seemed to weigh at least 190 pounds. John could remember the days when he was at least that weight, and the proud days of weighing 210 pounds of mostly muscles. The childhood of starvation had led to an adulthood of wanting to have a body like the ones of the bodybuilders, which would be for John a testament that his body was strong and healthy and well taken care of. He had been very conscientious about what he ate, drank, and what he did with his body, which was why the Snickers had been his one indulgence. But the days of choice were behind him now. John had picked up most of what he learned about bodybuilding in the same manner that he had with his art from the streets of Atlanta. After school, instead of going home to measly meals and sometimes no meals, he would wander the streets looking for odd jobs in exchange for food. And during that time, two things began to fester into his brain. The first was when he saw graffiti art all over the walls of a corner bar, and the first sight of vibrant spray paint contorted into the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. With her natural braids hanging down the span of her naked back, her big black eyes penetrating his very soul, he had been hooked. As he continued to explore his neighborhood and the ones next to his, he noted this pattern was increasing, and he began practicing on the inside walls of abandoned buildings. He was also caught in awe by the sight of the men in the public parks who made bench presses and weightlifting equipment from innovative materials they had picked up at the junkyard or what was discarded. John had made a pledge to himself that one day he would look like these men. Weightlifting and working out were also a means of building up strength. This he had used to his advantage when he finally struck back at his father. He wiped the chocolate smudges off the ticket and huddled with the group of men, who were as boisterous in their banter that they didn't take much notice of him. Neither did the security guard, who was more concerned with getting an autograph from one of them than doing a body scan. Before John could think twice about what he was doing, he was handing over the ticket he had found in the garbage and sitting in a back row of the packed theater, praying that he was inconspicuous. As John settled into the back row, praying that the two women seated next to him wouldn't smell his unwashed body, the curtains went up. The announcer made the introductions. The crowd stood on their feet in applause, and the live performance began. From the second it started, John felt he was transported, and he was captivated by everything unfolding before his eyes. The play was quite humorous. He couldn't help but laugh out loud with the hundreds of people who sat as captivated as he was by the performers, as the performers brought larger-than-life characters to the audience. John wondered about the people seated in the hall, about their lives, their story of what brought them here at this particular moment in time. A quick glance around the semi-darkness revealed men and women of all ages and race, but mostly what appeared to be African Americans. There were men and women of all shapes and sizes, with different fashion sense, with as varied body languages. John wondered how many of them planned to commit suicide after they walked out of the halls that night. In a few moments, he had completely forgotten what he had planned to be doing at this very minute. During the first act of the play, two muscled actors who looked more like bodybuilders performed with two actresses. One of the actors was bare-chested, his muscles accentuated with oils and the center of attention. A few rows ahead, the basketball players who had enabled John to enter the theater barefooted howled and gave war calls of acknowledgement, even as the women in the audience gave loud cat calls and screamed their appreciation for the hunks on the set. John reached beneath his torn clothing, searching for the muscles which had disappeared. He could feel inch by inch of his rib cage, actually counting the ribs as he felt along the skeletal frame he no longer recognized. He pulled his hand away, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he shook the thoughts aside as he focused on the play once more. "That's him," one of the women said to the other, as the lead character appeared for the first time. He was dressed as an old woman, and although it was obviously a man, the character from the very beginning took on her own persona, and it was as if the actor didn't exist. John had never heard of the actor, director, playwright before, but it didn't take him long to see why the show had been sold out. He was enjoying the performance and laughing out loud until the performers in a jail scene began singing about being down on their luck, with no way to win and no hope for them. Suddenly, John could relate, and he felt as if they were verbalizing his current situation. When one of the female actresses began singing to God in search of help, John felt as if he had been cornered and the spotlight was now on him. The song opened with, "I Come to You," and included lyrics about God being the only one who could help. With the expressions of how painful what was being experienced felt, John's hands began to tremble. He looked around the semi-dark room, expecting to see someone gazing at him in anticipation of him cracking. This had to be a test of some sort. Someone, he had no idea whom, must have known how this night would end for him. Maybe finding that ticket had been someone's plan to get him here at this particular time. But who on earth would know him like that? He had no friends, no one that he had ever spoken to, except to ask for work in exchange for a meal, or his dealer whenever he could afford to see him. The pizza man was the closest person to a colleague that he had. The actress went on to sing that if God sent his strength, they would make it through. With only a word from the Lord, they knew help was on the way if they would just hold on. Was there help on the way for him? Should he hold on, if not for himself, maybe for his mother? She had always held fast that one day her sons would be okay, and for a little while John had been. Maybe it wasn't as simple as he would have liked to believe. Maybe his mother did need a note explaining what had happened, something telling her that he was sorry. A mother was always the last one to give up hope, and maybe his was still hanging on for some miracle. In a few minutes he was laughing again, along with the entire audience. But soon, one of the inmates in another jail scene was being told that Jesus loves her. She at first was astonished by the revelation, stating that she wasn't a good person. She never believed in Jesus, and that he couldn't accept her just as she was. Still, she was encouraged that Jesus did love her, just as she was. As she began singing, "Yes, Jesus loved me," a single tear slid down John's face. It was followed by another and another. Before he knew what was happening, his shoulders were shaking and he could no longer see the set. But he did see Candace. She was kneeling by their bed the first morning they woke up in their apartment. She had patted the spot next to her as he had rolled over and saw her there. "Come, pray with me," she had said. John had gotten out of bed, knelt beside her, and they had prayed. It was the only time in his adult life that he could remember praying. As a child, his mother had taught them how, but they had never even seen her pray often. As he got older, John had come to realize that praying and living the Christian life was something people believed when they came from a middle or upper class family. It was for the people who were blessed. and they could in turn bless and pray with others. Candace had tried to convince him otherwise, and when she wasn't given much of a chance to do much of anything in her short life, John was convinced that there was now no reason whatsoever to believe in God. He never had the courage to pick up another paintbrush after Candace died. In a matter of months, he had practically given away all that he had completed to his landlord in exchange for letting him stay in the apartment, where he spent his days smoking drugs he had bought with the last of their savings. The drugs were the only thing that numbed the pain, and when all the money and the paintings were gone, he was out on the streets. He still smoked whenever he could get enough money to buy it, but he no longer lived for his next fix. In the last few weeks, he only lived for this day, Candace's birthday, to join her wherever she was. The inmate prayed that Jesus loved even her, and that as he poured out his blessings, that he please let some drops fall on her. But it wasn't just falling down on her. John felt it falling down on him also. He saw Candace amidst the blurry vision. She was on the set as well, hovering over the actors so that he could see her, and she was telling him not to give up, to hold on. As the scene ended and a temporary darkness fell over the stage, John blew his nose into his tattered shirt, smelling the unwashed fabric. He wiped his face quickly and looked with shame over at the women seated next to him. But he had no need for shame, as both women were weeping openly into handkerchiefs. As John glanced around at the rest of the audience, he was shocked that there was hardly a dry eye in the house. Even the basketball players had grown as still as a tomb, and one of them sat staring at the stage, his face soaked in his own tears. And then the moments of uplifting and rejoicing as the performers sang love songs that brought nostalgia and romance. The entire audience was singing along as the lead character encouraged their participation, and it became a walk down memory lane. It seemed that all their hearts were beating to the sound of one drum. And there too John saw Candace. He saw them dancing to some of the songs being sung. He closed his eyes and felt Candace's small body mold to his. He felt the softness of her small brown hands clasped in his. He felt the trust she had instilled in his as she allowed him to lead her around the room, closing her eyes and being completely surrendered to him and the music. He could smell the coconut shampoo in her hair, and right then he knew that she had never really left him. She would always be with him. And then the moments of affirmations as the lead, star, director, producer also took on the role of counselor and talked to the audience. It was more of a sermon than anything else. The words were so true. They summed up everything about a person's life in just a few minutes. And when it was over, John, like so many others, felt he was so much better for it that his life would never be the same. After the production and standing ovations, the genius behind it all, having discarded his lead character, came out on the stage to personally thank everyone for coming out and supporting the play. He also told them that proceeds from the production would go to aid some of the victims of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. As he admitted that he couldn't swim and might have been in the same predicament as many trapped by the floods had he been there, John was shocked at the similarities between himself and the actor. After his speech, the actor encouraged the audience to leave so that the cast and crew could begin dismantling the set for their next city tour. As the hall began to empty, John found he couldn't move right away. He didn't want to walk out of the theater. He had nowhere else to go. "Excuse me, is there something I can help you with?" the mogul asked John. John had been lurking around the set, adjusting chairs, sweeping up discarded food wrappers, anything to seem busy and a part of the cleanup crew. As he stood up, he regarded the man that he had come to respect so much in the few hours he had known him. Everything he had gathered from the people working around him was of genuine love and admiration for this man. John even found out things that further confirmed their similarities. "I was just helping out here," John answered. "Oh, really?" John knew he was busted. He knew that anyone looking at him could see he didn't belong there. He didn't fit in with the rest of the crew and helpers, even without the bare feet. He looked like a malnourished drug addict, and he began to tremble in his oversized clothes. He looked down at his feet. "What's your name, bro?" He hesitated a moment, the question catching him off guard. The look he received was not one of accusation or pity. He became aware of all the other cast and crew members stopping what they were doing and gazing in their direction, waiting for his response. "I'm John Quincy Roberts." "Hey, how you doing?" said the actor, extending his big hand and introducing himself. John placed his hand in the other man's, looking him straight in the eyes as they shook. "I'm much better now, thanks." "Nice to meet you, John. Did you enjoy the show?" Yes, very much so. I think it changed my life." "Oh, good, good. Glad you liked it." "So, John, where's your shoes?" "I don't have any," John answered honestly. "What size are you, about a 13? Yeah, size 13. "I thought so. I am too." As John watched in astonishment, the mogul lifted his feet and untied the laces of his shiny black shoes. He took them off and handed them to John. "That's okay, you can have these. I've got a few pairs in my dressing room," he said. Then, with a laugh that John had come to recognize as contagious, he added that he could also borrow one from his character's wardrobe. And what a sight that would be, him walking out into the streets in old woman's heels. John took the shoes, slipped them on his feet, and stood up for the first time in months, without the soles of his feet actually touching the ground. "They feel all right?" "Yes, they feel all right." "Good. Why don't you finish up what you're doing and come around back and have a meal with us? We got a long night ahead." "Okay." As his newfound inspiration began to turn away, John had to ask, "You really don't know how to swim?" "No, man, I can't swim," the actor admitted again. "Neither can I," John said. That night, as John headed to a motel to spend the night, he passed the Mitchell Street Bridge. He didn't tell anyone on the set that the money he had been paid would buy him a bed for the first time in a year and a half, and he didn't tell anyone that he wouldn't be taking them up on the offer to return to work the next night. He now knew what path his life was meant to take, and he had finally been set on the right course to get him there. He hoped that one day the actor, director, playwright would know what an impact that Snickers bar, the lost ticket, and the play had had on his life. As the cold wind beat against his face and he lowered his head for protection against the blast, the bridge beckoned nearby, but John ignored it and walked on. "5 years later, John Quincy Roberts stood beneath the marquee with his name on it. His artwork was being auctioned that entire week, and most of the pieces held red sold stickers on them. In the first 2 days, he had collected enough to write a generous check to one of the favorite charities of the man who had saved his life. Standing next to John, with clarity and jubilation etched between the lines of her 75-year-old face, was his mother Doris. "I'm so proud of you, my boy, and Candy is looking down from heaven, proud of you too," she said. The day would have been Candace's birthday had she not been killed. To honor this day, John had brought his mother to the exhibition of 5 years of his work. His first pieces were inspired by the plague that had saved his life, and he had painted 50 scenes inspired by the characters portrayed on the set. The very first piece, of a woman behind bars, rejected and abandoned, was the first to pull him out of the prison his life had become. Over the following weeks, he found that there was never a spare moment when he didn't have a paintbrush in hand. He had gone to the pizza house where the waiter had been particularly good to him and had gotten a job taking out the garbage. His first assignment found him seated on the cold pavement, getting his fill of what was edible before discarding everything. 2 weeks later, he didn't even look at what he was discarding. Eventually, when it was obvious that he had kicked his drug habit, he was allowed to wash dishes. 6 months later, he was working as a waiter. He worked hard, loved the pizza, and would use his money to pay his motel bill, buy food, and art supplies. As his zest for life was restored, he began painting pictures of Candace, which took on a life of its own, and soon the paintings were telling the rest of their story, even though they never actually lived it. It was what John knew would have been, and he poured his love into it. He saw and depicted their first home, their daughter, then their son, them growing old together, always in love, always in one spirit. Eventually, he landed a job in an art gallery, and that brought him the opportunity to take out a mortgage on his first home. As he walked through the doors that first day there, he thought of Candace. The gunman had been captured, pleaded guilty, and was now serving a life sentence behind bars. John had toyed with the idea of going to see him, just to see what he looked like, see the man who had taken all of his hopes and dreams away from him. He wanted in any small way to make that man pay. But John knew that without a doubt, Jesus loved even the gunman and would forgive him if he asked. Hating him, wanting to punish him, wasn't going to bring him one more second with his wife. "Your father would have been proud of you too, John," Doris said. "Well, I don't know about that," John responded, unconvinced. "Pops was a mean old bastard. I can't see how you stayed with him and put up with that all these years." "It was all I knew, John. It had been my whole life, and I was powerless to know any different. When you, my hope for a change, ended up on drugs and then on the streets, I thought it confirmed that was all there was to life, and all I could do was survive. I had given up on surviving the last time I stood here." "What do you mean? How does one go about giving up on surviving?" Doris made a little chuckling sound deep in her throat, which was an indication to John. She thought he was using the term figuratively. John's hand shook as he turned away from the theater and held his mother towards him. She was a rather tall woman herself, and in pumps she stood almost at eye level with John. John had gained most of his weight back, and his body showed little signs of the abuse he had put it through. "Mom, I had given up 5 years ago. I felt Candy's death was my fault, that everyone, including myself, blamed me for putting her in that position. And I didn't want to go on without her. I couldn't. I had been living on the streets, eating out of garbage bins, and there was nowhere for me to go, no hope left for me. I was going to walk to the Mitchell Street Bridge and jump in. The water was freezing, and because I couldn't swim, I knew all I had to do was just let myself sink to the bottom, and it would all be over. But the hand of God reached down to me and pulled me up. I went into this theater to see a play, and it saved my life." His mother trembled in his arms. Her body went limp, and she searched his face, barely being able to see through her own tears. "John, nobody blamed you for Candy's death. It was nobody's fault other than the man who shot her. I didn't believe that at the time, but I know that now. Did you stop to imagine what it would have been like for me when I got the news that you were dead? 2 sons gone already and a third taken his own life. the one sure way to never be redeemed to God's mercies? Did you stop to think of me? Yes, Mother, I did, John said. He held his mother as she told him how happy she was that he had. He told her that he had turned his life around that night and even learned how to swim. And he told her that he would try to forgive his father, even though he was no longer able to ask for it himself. John promised his mother that he would continue to visit his brothers behind bars. He would share with them the forgiveness of Christ and study with them in an effort to find the peace that he had. One of his brothers was getting out soon, and John would offer him a job working with him. As John told his mother about the guidance counselor at his old school. She was a beautiful, compassionate woman, and they had been dating a year now. He was planning on asking her to marry him. He knew that he had been given a second chance, and he would take it. As they walked into the theater hand in hand, hundreds of people milled around them, many of them going in to see his show. John stopped for a moment, turned back into the November night, and walked over to the garbage bin at the entrance of the theater. He unlaced the shoes that had been given to him 5 years ago, which he had kept in excellent condition and only wore on very special occasions, and removed them. He left them on the chapped pavement next to the bin. Maybe someone needed them more now than he did. The end. Okay, here it is again. Enchantment Story of the Month, written and published in 2011. I hope you've enjoyed this. And I just want to say that without trying to give away who the story is actually inspired by, the story came about one day when I was cleaning Enchantment, and to give myself a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of company, I had on a DVD of a play. And as I listened to the play and cleaned the library, I was suddenly overtaken by scenes that happened in the play, and I was just inspired by it. And I thought to myself that this man, this playwright, this very famous person, must have in his lifetime saved someone's life. Not physically, but just through his work. His life story, the inspiration of his work, the work that he puts out is so inspiring. I was convinced that his work must have saved someone's life. And as I didn't know of anyone whose life that he had literally saved, I decided to write this story of John Quincy Roberts. And that's how his last meal came about. Once again, I thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, and you can please share it with anyone, you can comment. And again, I hope you tune in again for another story. But please purchase the book. I am doing this to promote my work. The book is available on Lulu. Some of my work is also available on Amazon, at the National Art Gallery in Nassau as well, and of course at Enchantment in Greencastle. You can get an autographed copy. Thank you so much and have a good time.